This is Tokens. I'm Lee C. Camp.
We face a fake news epidemic, the likes of which we've never seen. And at least one of the ingredients in that epidemic is the fact that we have access to this wonderful technology.
That's Justin McBrayer, professor of philosophy at Fort Lewis College and executive director of the Society of Christian Philosophers.
The same technology that makes it easy to find the truth also makes it easy to produce disinformation. Think of how strange it is that on social media you get to pick your friends. Technology has allowed us to create environments after our own image.
Today we discuss Justin's new book, Beyond Fake News, Finding the Truth in a World of Misinformation. It explores the current crisis of a world built on false information, worsened by new technology and media. We'll also talk about some surprising ways in which we ourselves often play oblivious roles in the perpetuating of such a crisis, and some practices we may adopt to combat the spread, both within ourselves and within our larger communities of fake news.
This same technology that can contribute to the problem can also be part of the solution.
All this coming right up. Justin McBrayer is professor of philosophy at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. He's also the executive director of the Society of Christian Philosophers, and he is the author of the recently released book, Beyond Fake News, Finding the Truth in a World of Misinformation. Welcome, Justin.
Happy to be here. Fun to talk to you.
Yeah, it's really good to have you here with us today. And you're off in Colorado in the midst of a snowstorm the day we're taping this.
That's right. So this is one example of how technology allows us to circulate information around the globe at the snap of a fingers.
Yes.
Doesn't matter what the weather is, doesn't matter how much money you have. Easy to get information out there.
Which is precisely part of at least at one level, the problem that you're pointing us to, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We face a fake news epidemic, the likes of which we've never seen. And at least one of the ingredients in that epidemic is the fact that we have access to this wonderful technology. The same technology that makes it easy to find the truth also makes it easy to produce disinformation.
Yeah. Well, we'll dig into that a lot. And I do really appreciate your book. I find it smart, as I would expect from a philosopher. But I also find it beyond that. I appreciate that you're very intentional about being nonpartisan. There's enough examples in the book, enough to bother partisans of either right or left, which is always a good sign, I think, and pointing us to the practical ways in which philosophy matters. So grateful for the book and all that you bring together in this book. I think that it points as well to the way in which academics often get depicted as kind of ivory tower dwellers who have nothing to say to the real world, but it seems that you have something you desperately want to say to the real world.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think academics have a reputation, sometimes well-earned, for living their lives in the ivory tower and debating these arcane, issues that don't seem to have any bearing on the lives of normal people. Well, fake news is definitely not one of those problems. So when it comes to figuring out why there's a fake news epidemic, when it comes to figuring out how we can get ourselves out of it, both at the personal level and at the social level, philosophers, theologians, economists, psychologists have an awful lot to say about that set of issues. And over the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen that they've stepped up to the challenge and are really trying to help us as a public to think through this cluster of issues.
Any particular episode or incident get you as a philosopher especially interested in the issue of fake news?
Yeah, actually, Lee, I fell for it. So my family and I were in Austria in 2016 during the presidential election. And in the aftermath of the election, both conservatives who were very happy and liberals who were not were trying to figure out what was happening. It didn't look like Donald Trump was going to win the election. People were really interested in how people had got the prediction so wrong. And at least part of the story there was the presence of fake news stories that had circulated on social media. So I naturally started looking into some of the stories that had circulated. And it turns out that I found one that I liked. It really hit my buttons and I forwarded it to some friends. And so I had been a victim of fake news. And that just got me thinking, gosh, this is something that hit home with me. Surely it's something that affected other people that I know and that I care about and that I chat with. And so I started investigating fake news because I was on the wrong side of it.
Before we dive in a bit more, why don't you give us a sort of definition of fake news as you're using it in the book?
Yeah, sure. Fake news isn't really a technical term. It's a term that's been bandied about for a number of years. And I'd use it for any sort of information or misinformation that distorts your picture of the world. So you can think of information as just being true statements that are not misleading. But there's also information that's misleading. It's strictly speaking true. But when you accept that information, it distorts your view of the world. Just the other day, I asked my sons if they left me any cereal in the box. And one of my sons said, yeah, I left you some. Well, I go and look and there's, 2 flakes of cereal in the bottom of the box. Now, technically what he said was true, but it was misleading information. So fake news also encompasses that sort of thing. And then philosophers distinguish between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is false material that's being spread unintentionally. So, for example, when a reporter makes a mistake. And then disinformation is false information that's spread on purpose with the goal of deceiving an audience. So fake news is a kind of an umbrella term that covers misleading information, misinformation, and disinformation. And it turns out that there's an awful lot of all three out there.
You use the analogy of pollution to describe the epidemic of fake news. Why that particular term?
I mean, if you think about a landscape, your enjoyment of the landscape, the pursuit of your goals of having a good time outside and so forth can be marred by the fact that a landscape could be littered. If there was junk everywhere and litter everywhere, it'd be really hard to appreciate the beauty of the scene. Well, fake news functions in the same sort of way. It's sort of like pollution in your informational environment. You're trying to figure out what's true. You're trying to achieve particular goals. And it's difficult for you to do that if your informational environment is so littered with fake news that you literally can't see the truth. So I think it's useful to think about fake news as a kind of pollution. It's pollution on the TV channel. It's pollution in what you read. It's pollution on your social media feed. And it's that pollution that I think is driving things like partisanship and driving really bad decision-making at the personal level.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the genealogy of fake news. You point to historical precedents here that the notion of misinformation and disinformation is not necessarily new, going back, for example, to 19th century partisan newspaper publications, right?
Absolutely. So it's not as if fake news is a new problem in that sense. People have long had interest to deceive one another, to deceive the public, and so forth. But what's unique about the crisis that we're facing now is that it's just so much worse than it has been at any point in time in the past. We face a really acute problem. And at least one of the ingredients for why the problem is so acute now, even though it's not a new problem, is the fact that we have technology that allows us to produce and disseminate misinformation and disinformation at literally the touch of a button. That's something that our forebears in the 19th century couldn't do. It cost money to buy a press, to buy ink, to circulate papers and so forth. So it was actually quite difficult to manufacture, fake news. Not so anymore.
Yeah.
You can do it from a laptop just about anywhere in the world.
When you point to the ways in which local newspaper outlets, I think you said you had, 5 or 6 newspapers there in Durango, Colorado in the 19th century, but that there were kind of built-in mechanisms to check the unchecked proliferation of partisan news or fake news. Describe that for us.
Sure. I mean, you think about how news outlets in the 19th and 20th century operated. They used physical copy. They were stationed in particular locales, so they didn't have a kind of global reach or national reach. And the fact that it cost money to print papers, the fact that you had to have someone run across town and deliver it at a doorstep, that limited the reach of the information, good or bad. It limited the scope of your audience, so to speak. Well, not anymore. Now we've got multinational corporations that are spinning news across the globe, and it costs them nothing to distribute it and next to nothing to produce it. Well, as soon as that happens, the incentives to capture a readership and the incentives to make a profit, now those incentives are not checked by things like location or how much paper is on hand or how much ink is on hand or how much your delivery guys can get out. There's no limit now on the way that we compete for readerships. And as soon as that happens, you're in a sort of Wild West media environment. And that's forcing people in a kind of arms race to capture audiences. And truth is just a victim of that sort of arrangement.
Right, yeah. I was fascinated, too, by the way you pointed to, and this made plenty of sense once I thought about it, but I had not thought about it, the ways in which in a local community you can have people you're working right next to reading a multiplicity of views from these different newspapers, and you're naturally going to have conversations with people that see things differently than you in your day-to-day life. Whereas increasingly we live in these siloed sorts of existences that don't have that same sort of give and take.
That's exactly right. Think of how strange it is that on social media you get to pick your friends.
Yeah.
That doesn't happen in a classroom. That doesn't happen typically at a church. That doesn't happen in your workplace environment. You work with your colleagues, you go to school with your schoolmates and so forth. But technology has allowed us to create environments after our own image, so to speak. Conservatives move to certain kinds of environments. Liberals move to certain kind of environments. We pick the people that we are comfortable with, that we like on our social media feeds. And what we're doing is we're sort of building our own silos that are blocking out people who are different from us. And when you do that, it's really hard for your bubble to be burst if you're not coming into contact with people who see the world differently from you.
And increasingly, I try in my own I don't do social media a whole lot, I do it some, but I try to check myself when I want to unfriend someone. But when I know that when I've seen them repeatedly share stuff that in my mind is simply fake news that has no credibility to it, it's like, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to listen to that. I don't have any personal relationship with this person, so there's no need for me to have that in my feed. But then, of course, that does mean that my feed starts looking increasingly like something else rather than the thing I don't want to be exposed to.
Yeah, Lee, what it ends up looking like is you.
Yeah.
Because what you're doing, right, is you're sort of holding up a mirror. And the further away these people get from, your theological views or your political views or whatever, I guess the more you're sort of rubbing one another wrong. So as those people fade out of your social media life, what you're left with is the people that you're really comfortable with.
Yeah, yeah. You talk a great deal about the ways in which there are incentives, particularly financial incentives, that the way our economic systems work naturally facilitate this sort of proliferation of the pollution of fake news. So describe that a bit for us.
Sure. I think the key insight is this, at least in the United States and much of the free world, the informational market is a free market. What that means is there are consumers who are willing to pay for information or put up with advertisements or whatever. And then there are producers of information who are willing to go through the hassle of producing and disseminating the information, provided they get a paycheck. That's just how the free market works. Well, in any subject matter, whether it's toasters or information, the free market doesn't give you the perfect product. Instead, free markets give you the product that people are willing to buy. The toaster that you go down to Walmart and buy this afternoon isn't the best toaster that we could possibly make. It sort of meets some minimum functioning threshold that people are willing to pay for. Look, information is no different. If information is being circulated in a kind of free market, then the kind of information that people consume isn't necessarily going to be purely factual or reliable or backed by good evidence or whatever. It's the consumers who decide the quality of information that will be traded on a free market. And the sad fact of the matter is, humans often have mixed motives when it comes to the truth, and we often care about other things more than the truth. And in a free market, that's what you're going to get.
Yeah. You have this fascinating, I don't know if we can do this for podcast listeners, but you have this fascinating diagram in 4 quadrants, A, B, C, D. At the top side of the square would be most truthful or perfectly truthful, as obviously a theoretical construct. And then at the bottom, least truthful. And then on the left is left partisanship, and on the right partisanship. Can you describe then kind of what you've discovered about the layout of American sources of media in that kind of system of looking at things?
Right. So this is just looking at 2 different ways to evaluate a news source. And I just picked a political way of looking at it. You could pick religious, you could pick whatever you want. But if we were looking at political bias, what we find is there's a variety of effective business strategies, a variety of different ways of making money. And each of those different ways differs depending on what sort of readership you're trying to capture. So for example, if you're imagining that space in front of you, where at the top of the piece of paper, that's a perfectly accurate source. At the bottom, it's a perfectly inaccurate source. What we find is that business strategies occupy a kind of pyramid. At the top of the pyramid, there are companies who have kind of made their name in providing unbiased, really accurate information. These are places like the Associated Press, places that then sell their information and their stories to news outlets both on the right and on the left. Then sliding down from the top of that pyramid, you get sources that become ever more partisan on either side, but they also become ever less truthful. And the fact of the matter is, there are readerships all along that pyramid. So there are some people who are willing to pay or put up with advertisements to see really partisan shows that beat up on the other side. Those are our viable business spaces, so to speak. And in a free market, you would expect that businesses would figure that out and then exploit them.
I'm reminded, as you're saying that, I have often thought that in listening to the ways in which I hear people of partisans, kind of left or right, talk about their partisan viewpoints, it oftentimes strikes me as it's the sort of way sometimes I hear people talk about their sports teams. It is a sort of game, it seems like a lot of times in my experience with people, where they're just trying to one-up the other side. And that then reminds me of a quote, and I can't remember who it was from. It was from a British journalist, I think, Orwell, right, that you quoted, who says that very often what happens is that our truth claims, especially our political truth claims, are never tested against real life realities. They don't have to bump up against it. And then he has this foreboding line about unless finally it gets tested on a battlefield. But describe that dynamic for us a bit more.
Yeah, it was Orwell. So this idea is that when it comes to a lot of claims in politics, we do not have strong incentives to get to the truth. Just take one innocuous case from a few years ago. How many people attended Donald Trump's inauguration? People look at the photographic evidence, people come away with very different beliefs about it. Look, if you're a conservative in deep Trump country, you have no incentive whatsoever to believe truly about how many people showed up at the inauguration. It doesn't make one whit of difference to how your life is going to go, how many people showed up at the inauguration. But fitting in with the people around you, cheering for your team, sticking one to your liberal friends, now you've got an incentive to do all of those things. And so you have no incentive to really figure out what's going on in this case, how many people showed up at the inauguration. And you have these other really powerful sort of team-based incentives, as you were describing them, or I would almost want to say tribal incentives to fit in with your people. And in a case like that, where you have no incentive to get to the truth and strong incentive to root for your team, it's not surprising at all that people would disagree about things like how many people showed up at the inauguration.
Throughout the book, you're not just speculating about these things, you're often quoting kind of social science studies that have been done on the tribalistic nature of our truth claims and so forth.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the points in the book is that we shouldn't just speculate about these things. We shouldn't just go with our gut intuition about how these sorts of things work. When it's a big question, when it's a question that we can't answer with our own God-given faculties, we need to rely on the work of experts.
Yeah.
So in this case, there's plenty of work that's been done by behavioral economists and by social psychologists testing how people respond to these sorts of situations. Let me just quickly mention one of them. That's just absolutely fascinating, this point about how we conform with the people around us. In one classic study, social psychologists drew lines on a wall, all three of which were different lengths. There was A was quite tall, B was in the middle, C was shorter. And then they invited participants in to ask them which line was tallest. And they would invite, 8 or 10 people in at a time. And one of those people was a true subject. And unbeknownst to them, the other 8 or 9 people in the line were actually Confederates of the experimenter. They were, grad students who were lined up. And what they would do is have the participant answer last and have everybody else in the line before them say that the middle line was actually the tallest one. And then we would get to the last person, the subject, who would at this point be totally bewildered. She could see that it wasn't the tallest, but everybody in front of her said it was the tallest. And 70% of the time, she would just agree with them. If we would agree with something just so blatantly obvious, then of course you can see how these kind of pressures would crop up in political circles and so forth.
Yeah, that's truly terrifying to consider the way in which such peer pressure operates on us. So you talked a bit about the ways in which the purveyors of fake news have incentives to mislead, and you started pointing then to the ways in which consumers too have an incentive to be misled by our tribalism and so forth. Other things there on things that we need to be aware of ourselves about the ways in which we're playing individually into the problem?
Yeah, so the point about incentives is this idea that you don't always want to get to the truth. Sometimes you'd rather just see the other side get beaten up. Sometimes you just want to feel some emotion. Sometimes you want to be entertained and so forth. That's not the whole of the problem, because often we really do want to get to the truth. So often we really do care about, these deep political questions like, will a minimum wage, help people in our country get ahead and that sort of thing. So often we do want the truth. But even then, we're plagued by the fact that just our human equipment has not left us in a position where we're perfect truth seekers. The kind of mind that we have can be exploited in particular ways. And it has what I call these kind of intellectual blind spots that leave us in a position where we too often gravitate to mistaken answers, even when we do deeply want the truth.
What are some examples of that?
Social psychologists call these things heuristics. They're sort of like mental shortcuts. And it turns out that there's a whole bunch of mental shortcuts that we take in our everyday life to try to figure out what the world is like around us. One example of this is it's called anchoring bias. Think of an anchor on a ship. If you drop an anchor off, the ship can only wander in a certain amount on either side of that anchor. The anchor restricts its movement one way or the other. Well, it turns out that human thinking is prone to a kind of anchoring bias. The first piece of information that we get, the first number or piece of data that we get, anchors our mind in a certain way where we only think in limited increments on one side or the other. Let me give you a concrete example. Psychologists took some subjects and asked them how old Gandhi was when he died. For half of the subjects, they invited them into a room, one at a time, and said, I can't remember, did Gandhi die when he was 8 years old or older? Now, immediately when they said 8 years old, that anchored those subjects' minds. And they thought, well, obviously he wasn't 8. He freed India, so he must have been older than 8. I'll guess 51. The other half of the subjects, they brought them in and they said, I can't remember how old Gandhi was when he died. I think it was 140. Is that right? And people thought, oh, no, definitely wasn't 140. No one lives that old. But how much less was it? Maybe he was 86. And so you see what happened was this random piece of information that wasn't even anywhere close to being correct biased people's ultimate judgment calls about what's going on. People who got the 8-year-old number up front guessed a number in the 50s. People who got the 140 guessed the 80s. This huge spread because we were anchored. And this is what happens day in and day out in the news. Just think of what's happening right now with the Democratic proposal for a kind of stimulus or coronavirus bailout. They're throwing around the 1.9 number. As soon as that number's thrown out, anyone who listens to the story doesn't think, maybe we don't need one at all. Maybe we need one 10 times larger. Maybe we need one 10 times smaller. Instead, you start at the 1.9 number and you just sort of vary it slightly on either side of that. And when you're aware that our minds work in these sorts of ways, it's a lot easier to confront fake news.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've heard people who teach negotiating use that very same technique as leverage in negotiating, right? So if you put out the first number, then you've set expectations about kind of a range within which this is going to go. And it's a very powerful sort of rhetorical move. Huh.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That when you're selling your house, you want to be the one to offer the first
Yeah,
number.
right. Yeah. Are there other ways in which consumers have this incentive to be misled?
I mean, the fact of the matter is we spend most of our life absorbing information incidentally. When you're on the train, you read the news, or while you're cooking in your kitchen, you have the news channel on or whatever. The fact of the matter is we have all sorts of motives, all sorts of goals in our everyday life. And getting a perfect read on what's going on in the world is often not at the top of the pile.
Right.
So we have competing interests coming from family and from work and from a need for entertainment and so forth. And I think anytime you're in that kind of mixed motive environment, we shouldn't be surprised that people consume information in ultimately a kind of irresponsible way, at least irresponsible with regard to getting the truth.
Yeah.
Instead, they're going to consume information in ways that meet all of those other needs.
Right. Well, I know for myself that The Economist is my main printed source of news. I don't know where it would fall on your upside down V. I suspect it's fairly somewhere close to the middle. But a lot of times my conversations that I have with family or friends sometimes will come out of that, but sometimes it'll come out of just whatever headline pops up on my iPad. And, I admittedly don't read the story. I'm just looking at the headline, and that becomes a matter of conversation with friends or family.
Right. And actually, Lee, this flags one interesting way in which technology is contributing to the fake news problem, other than just making it easy to, produce disinformation and circulate or whatever. It's fascinating how much technology controls what we end up reading. You say you click on stories at the top of your headline. That's no accident that those kind of stories end up there. The stories that end up in your Facebook feed. Even, as I found out in doing the research in this book, what you Google.
Right.
If you Google something from Nashville, Tennessee, and I Google something from Durango, Colorado, you and I are almost certain to get different results. So it's not as if there's this pool of information that we all somehow have equal access to. The information is being curated behind the scenes to give us the stuff that we like, that we'll click on, and so forth. And if technology is being used, algorithms are being used to curate information in that way, well then, of course, it's no surprise that people in the United States disagree about things like climate change. Well, the climate change denier searches something on Google and the climate change acceptor Google something, they're getting wildly different results.
You're listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, and the Good Life. Most grateful to have you joining us. We'd love to know where you are listening from. Send us an email at podcast@tokenshow.com. Remember, too, you can catch us for our special public radio episodes on Sundays here in Nashville, 2 o'clock Nashville time on WPLN 90.3, or streamed all over the globe at WPLN.org. And we'd be delighted to have you join us for our live events, either in person or online. For more information, visit tokenshow.com. This is our interview with Professor Justin McBrayer on his book, Beyond Fake News, Finding the Truth in a World of Misinformation. Coming up, more troubling truths about the fake news epidemic and some hopeful practices with which we may be able to combat it. You're listening to Tokens and our interview with Professor Justin McBrayer on his book, Beyond Fake News, Finding the Truth in a World of Misinformation. Well, let's talk a little bit about possibilities for doing better. What sorts of prescriptions do you have for us?
Two pretty obvious things that we could do. One, we could be aware of our intellectual blind spots. And two, we could make an intentional effort to engage other people with whom we disagree. So let me say something quickly about both. Mm-hmm. When you're driving and you're going to change lanes, at least I was taught you should look over your shoulder and check out this kind of spot, by your rear bumper, a spot that doesn't show up in your side mirror, doesn't show up in your rear view mirror. It's literally a blind spot. And the idea is if you stop for a second and take an intentional look, you'll save yourself from some accidents. I think the same is true when it comes to the consumption of information. if you know that you suffer from an anchoring bias, if you know that we have confirmation bias and some of these other intellectual blind spots, then when you're reading the news, you'll just take a second look. You'll know that you're prone to falling into certain kind of traps, and you'll look over your shoulder and do a good job of making sure that that blind spot isn't getting you into trouble. So that's one thing we can do. And then the second is we can make an intentional effort to read sources that are coming from the other side, have conversations with people who are on the other side, and try to engage the informational environment in a more neutral way rather than in this sort of served up partisan way that has become so easy with technology.
Yeah. Related to those skills, you talk about big questions and little questions.
I'm trying to distinguish between questions that we can reliably answer on our own using our own God-given equipment, and then questions that require some kind of outside expertise. Here's an example of what I mean. Many people think the 2020 presidential election was stolen. Well, here's the fact of the matter. Whether or not it was stolen is a big question. You can't think about it from your armchair. You can't talk to your friends about it and try to figure out what's going on. It's well beyond our cognitive tools to figure out. I mean, think of what a big question that is, what you'd have to know to figure out that it was stolen. So if you want to take a stance on whether the election was stolen or not, you're going to need outside help. You're going to need the word of experts. You're going to need some special technology or whatever. So the idea is once we're clear on the fact that some of the questions we face in life are big questions and some are small questions, then we can reliably sort questions into the kind that we need to ask for outside help on or not. And in the election case, it's a perfect example. We shouldn't endorse the idea that the election was stolen unless there's some kind of outside expertise that could run a study or provide extra evidence that would confirm that that's so.
Yeah. As you were saying that, I was thinking back to a story, an episode in which someone that I was privy to was saying that they felt like that there had been a lot of fraud in the election. And this other person said, "Why do you think that?" And they said, "I just have this gut feeling that there was." Right? That's precisely what you're pointing to. And on the big questions, to reply, "I just have a gut feeling," should be off the table as never acceptable.
That's exactly right. Big questions are the ones that we can't answer with our gut feelings, our intuition, or even our kind of natural faculties. A question like that is the kind of question that we need outside help on. So if you're tempted to answer a big question with something like, "Oh, I can just see that it's so," or "I just have this feeling," or whatever, I urge you to resist that temptation.
Why do you suspect that we see these various forms of opposition to expertise?
Oh my, Lee, that's a big question.
Yeah.
That in itself is a big question that I would need help answering.
What's your gut tell you about that?
The only thing I can say with any level of confidence is this. There is a long strain of anti-expertise in the United States going back at least a couple centuries. So given the kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps, independent thinking, that Americans cherish, Americans have a fraught relationship with experts. And there's quite a bit of really interesting research out there about how we're willing to disregard the word of experts when doing so, gives us the answer that we want. In fact, there's a really good book called The Death of Expertise that chronicles some of that anti-expert phenomena here in the United States.
But practically speaking, most people, sure, you can have some folks who are completely off the grid, for example, or refuse to employ the benefits of Western medicine. But it seems that in most places, practically speaking, we're always dependent upon people who can answer the big questions, right, with some sort of expertise.
Absolutely. And the fact of the matter is we're just being convenient skeptics,
right,
when we disregard the experts that we don't like. I mean, someone can turn around and take an aspirin knowing full well that it will relieve a headache, and then turn around the very next breath and say something negative about vaccines.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that it's the same group of experts that's provided the knowledge in both cases.
Right.
So it's not that have this sort of wholesale rejection of experts. It's just that we pick and choose, and we accept their word when we like what they're saying, and we reject it when it's contrary to the lines of our tribe.
Yeah. Yeah.
By the way, that's not conservative, both sides do
Right.
this, right? So, liberals have their stories about, minimum wage, and, they're disregarding work that's happening from experts in different economics departments or whatever. So this is not a partisan issue. All of us have this urge to sort of trust experts when we like what they're saying and not otherwise.
Let's talk a little bit about the issue of censorship, which obviously is a huge issue right now in the wake of the 2020 election and the realities of some of the moves that Facebook, Twitter, Instagram have made recently. What's your take on practices of censorship?
Sure. Well, just a bit of background first. If the informational environment is polluted, you might just think, well, let's clean it up. If the problem is you've got all this fake news out there, let's just stop the flow of fake news and voila, problem solved. And that's the kind of background thought that gives rise to this idea that what we need are better controls from the government, controls from social media companies or whatever. If we could control the flow of information, we have a better shot at, cleaning up our informational environment. This is controversial, but I think that strategy is deeply misguided. I don't think that putting a Facebook monitor in charge of deciding what's true and what's false and censoring the things that she thinks is false is a good idea. Just yesterday, someone was banned from Twitter for circulating misinformation about vaccinations. Everyone by this point in time knows that Donald Trump was permanently banned from Twitter for tweeting misinformation and that sort of thing. Where does that end? I have no idea how someone in Silicon Valley can patrol social media and clamp down on stories that they think are false and somehow save us from the polluted informational environment. If nothing else, what we'll find is the environment starts to look more and more like the censor and not more and more accurate.
It's been 25 years probably since I read this essay by Stanley Fish, who's a philosopher at Duke. The title was something like, "Why There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, and It's a Good Thing Too." And again, I don't know how much I can recollect about his argument. I know that as that has sat in my psyche over the last number of decades, it has caused in me a question about whether or not the whole notion of free speech as such is a false construct. So, for example, I think one of the most laughable, obvious examples of this, if you go from Nashville over to the Smoky Mountain National Park and you stop at the visitor center on this side of the park, outside the visitor center, there is a sign, and I've got a picture of it. There's a sign there that says, "This is a free speech area, free speech permitted within I don't know what it is, 100-yard diameter." And I just think, it's like, that's a really good picture of the practicalities of free speech, right? Is that we're always imposing certain limits upon legitimate speech in all contexts. I don't think that there's a direct line from what I just said to a kind of heavy-handed censorship either. But at the same time, it does seem to me helpful to realize that the process or the practice of speaking freely always entails constraints, judgment, what's going to get said when, what can't be said when, and so forth. So I don't know, give me some other thoughts about that or pushback on that or what that raises for you.
I think the general point is right. The general point is that free speech isn't an all or nothing thing. And I think that's the point you were making.
Yeah.
It comes in degrees. And in different contexts and different social environments, those degrees might be tightened up, right? Or they might be loosened more. And I think that's fine. I think that's appropriate. What I don't think is appropriate is that we should have some non-elected official in Northern California who gets to make a call on whether something's true or false and then silences someone because they think it's false. That seems like it's, even if free speech always comes into degree, that's too far on one side to have unelected private company people making calls to permanently silence, members of their social community because what they're saying is false.
Yeah. It's definitely tricky, because I would assume that you would think that there are certain things that you would want Facebook perhaps to not permit on Facebook.
I mean, one sort of minimal line would be whatever the legal line is here in the United States. So things like defamation and classic examples like, shouting fire in a crowded theater.
Yeah.
If there's a sort of legal line, that's one thing. Then Facebook, say, is enforcing the law. But when they're going beyond that, coming up with their own policies, their own procedures, and censoring people merely because they're saying something that's false, that's a step too far.
Yeah. At least with the law, there's been some sort of extended social process of discernment around that, right?
Exactly. And at least in that case, it's public. You know what the law says. You know what the standards are. You know what you're being held accountable to. It can't be changed without elected officials' approval and so forth.
Yeah. As you've done this kind of work and with all the examples you give in the book, what's some of your favorite things you've discovered that on the one hand should be a big surprise to a liberal and on the other hand would be a big surprise to a conservative?
Great. I looked at some empirical research coming out of Harvard that looked at stories that were retweeted or stories that were shared on social media. And it was quite surprising to learn that the center-right had been more or less hollowed out. So here's what I mean by that. If you were to look at, say, a continuum with on the far right of the continuum, the people who are the most extreme right wing, left side of the continuum, the most extreme left wing, you would sort of expect a parallel between those two sides. Centrist stories get shared this much, center right and center left the same, and then extreme right and extreme left the same. That is not, in fact, what you've seen in the last 4 or 5 years. On the left, stories are more or less equally distributed. Center left stories get passed around over social media, and far left do, and so forth. But on the right, there is a distinct valley where the center right would be. Center right stories were not being picked up or shared nearly as much as center stories or far right stories. And that was news to me and really interesting to see that piece of our political economy, so to speak.
What about a favorite episode of something on the left?
So the left seems to think that many mainstream media news sources are not leftist, as maybe you would think that they would. And it turns out that there are reams of studies showing that many mainstream news sources, places like CNN and New York Times, Washington Post, really are liberal by almost any way of measuring it. And here's one thing in particular that struck me when I was doing this research. It turns out that while journalists as a whole are pretty liberal, journalists who cover political stories are almost uniformly liberal. And one easy way to measure this is to go onto a news site, get all of the names of the reporters who work the political beats, and then contrast it or match that list of names up with election contribution data, which is public. And when we do that, we find that political reporters almost uniformly donate to Democratic candidates and Democratic causes and almost never contribute to Republican ones. And that's a surefire reason for thinking that the kind of political reporting you're getting from some of these mainstream places is going to be biased to the left.
Yeah, fascinating. You've given us a few things a moment ago, but any other kind of finishing encouragement on better practices?
Well, I think if you want to end on an encouraging note, I think there is reason to be optimistic. One reason to be optimistic is that people across the free world are now talking about fake news. They're worried about fake news. They're thinking about fake news. In a recent poll that was conducted in a number of Western countries, fake news turned out to be more worrisome to citizens than things like terrorism. Now, I think that's a reason to be optimistic. We understand that this has the power to disrupt our lives, to disrupt our political systems, and we're thinking about it. The second reason we should be optimistic is because this same technology that can contribute to the problem can also be part of the solution. It can be part of the ways that we connect with people who are different than us. It can be part of the solution to sorting which stories are legitimate and which ones have been manipulated. So people know and care about this issue, and we do have at least some of the tools to do a better job. So I'm optimistic that we will in the near future.
Been talking to Justin McBrayer, professor of philosophy at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado, about his recently released book, Beyond Fake News, Finding the Truth in a World of Misinformation. Thanks so much, Justin, for your work and for the great conversation today.
Thanks. Delighted to be here.
You've been listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, and the Good Life, and our interview with Professor Justin McBrayer. Please do remember to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and refer us to a fellow podcast listener. Got feedback? We'd love to hear from you. Email us text or attach a voice memo and send to the address podcast@tokenshow.com. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this podcast possible. Executive producer and manager Christy Bragg of Bragg Management, co-producer Jacob Lewis of Great Feeling Studios, associate producers Ashley Bain, Leslie Thompson, and Tom Anderson, our engineer Carriot Harmon, production assistant Kara Fox, music beds by Zach and Maggie White, and our live event production team at Stonebrook Media led by Phil Barnett. Thanks for listening, and peace be unto thee. The Tokens Podcast is a production of Tokens Media LLC and
Great Feeling Studios.